Welcome to the show that brings the living experiences of black men in the UK in a dialogue of equals with health professionals from the NHS and community advocates to reduce health inequalities affecting our communities.
Me and my unks had a dialogue of equals. We're tired of all our people dying before they seem to. Silence don't make you peaceful. So many open wounds, don't even know how we'll heal all. But this is food for thought of a meal. It might be a free course.
Greetings to our listeners and viewers, whoever else is out there, all of you who happen to be out there, and thank you for tuning in to this first ever episode of our podcast series called A Dialogue of Equals. It's a discussion between black men and the NHS. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-presentator, Michael Morgan, who's a writer and social commentator. My name is Stafford Scott. I'm a bit of a community activist, probably better known for talking about social and racial justice. But recently, because of experiences that I'll talk to throughout this podcast episode, really taking this issue of black man's health seriously. As a matter of fact, I come from Tottenham, and the community of Tottenham, we've been coming together far too often to remember people who have passed away at a relatively young age. So we're doing this podcast series in the hope that we can overcome many years, decades, and even centuries of mistrust between black people, particularly black men, and the healthcare sector. To help us to do this, we're going to have discussions with professionals from within the NHS, within the healthcare sector, and we're going to have advocates from within the community who really have a great and deep understanding of how the NHS provides services. So without further ado, I'm really pleased and happy to be able to introduce to you Professor Navqi, who is a professor of health equity. Didn't even know there was such a position, but shows that we've gone to every length to get the best possible people to come and be interviewed on this podcast, and also to have a discussion with Habib will be my good friend Patrick Vernon. Patrick is a cultural historian and also a long-time community advocate on a number of different issues, including, well, particularly around the Windrush nowadays, and particularly including health. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we remind people when they're actually looking, when they're viewing, when they're listening to this, that we're setting out the historical context of black men and in particular their experience of the NHS. But you and I are not experts. And that's why, a dialogue of equals as a title does work so well, because you and I aren't experts. Those people who are listening in, watching aren't experts. And together, I feel that we're going to learn from our guests and learn from each other.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Michael.
My first question really is for Habib. I mean, just breaking it down, the Race and Health Observatory, it sounds a quite grandiose title. Just for our viewers, just for our listeners, again, we just want to make things as plain as possible. What is this? What is this entity? What does it actually do? Because you're the CEO of this Race and Health Observatory, right?
So the idea of an observatory has been around, or was around for some time, even before COVID-19. But it wasn't until a special edition of the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, in 2019, that a very clear call for an observatory that essentially does three things. It brings together the evidence base where it exists, or establishes the evidence where it doesn't exist. Secondly, turns that evidence into policy recommendations for the healthcare system, recommendations for change. And then thirdly, it helps and supports organizations within the healthcare system, within the NHS, and leaders within the NHS to act upon those recommendations. But that special edition of the British Medical Journal was an important turning point. It was titled Racism in Medicine. And within the NHS, it was perhaps the first time we were beginning to talk about racism within our healthcare system.
So just on the theme of an observatory, when I think of an observatory, I think of the way in which it looks, it pans, it scans. Now, in order to pan, to scan, to look, in terms of contextualizing racism, how far back are you or have you looked to inform your work today? Because about 25 years ago, I read a book, and it was by Naeem Adbar. It was called The Psychological Chains of Slavery. And I do feel what we're seeing today is being manifested because of slavery and the interactions that happened from slavery. Does any of that, in terms of context, does any of that inform your work in terms of what you're looking at?
It absolutely does. And in fact, although the organization is called an observatory, we're not just here to be passive or to observe. We're a proactive agent for change. And in fact, all the work that we do, the reports that we produce, the interventions that we put forward are excuse removers. They're there to actually help and support and guide organizations to make the change that we want to see. But you're absolutely right as well. It's about going back in time to look at some of the trauma that we are now facing within our communities and tracking that back historically. We've had a long history of migration in this country that goes back not just years and decades, but centuries. We therefore have large and growing ethnic minority communities. And we've always, in terms of the healthcare system, has had good investment in healthcare research and interventions. The COVID vaccine was perhaps one example of a long list of interventions that have been developed within this country but have been migrated out in other parts of the globe. But at the same time, it can also be argued that our collective responses to some of the challenges that we see in health inequalities, which we'll come on to, have been somewhat fragmented, in a way costly and confused. And whereas organizations, think tanks, other commissions have been set up recently and over time, they haven't really focused on what we call the causes of the inequalities that we see. And some of those relate to the historical trauma that our communities have faced and experienced over generations.
And science has always been complicit in the construction and perpetration of some of these racist ideologies and practices, right?
And we see that today. I mean, the lack of representation in research. If I give you an example, the lack of representation in clinical trials leads to some of the bias, some of the racial bias that we then see play out. If I give you in fact, there are 3 examples of work that we're doing within the NHS Race and Health Observatory. The first is looking at an anti-cancer drug that doesn't get broken down as quickly in black bodies as it does in white bodies, and has led to higher levels of toxicity in bodies and sadly death. But if you think about the causes of the inequalities, the fact that there is a lack of representation in the research, the clinical trials and research that goes on to produce the drug, it means that the design doesn't take into account our diverse communities. And so in terms of this drug, when they look at the genome, the gene sequencing on how well the drug will work with different ethnicities, if there is a missing ethnicity, then that would not work well with that community. And in fact, with this anti-cancer drug, what we're finding now is the African gene that's missing. And so that's one example of how the lack of representation in research, the causes of the causes, is now having an impact on what we see play out, and that's differential outcomes in health. There are other examples as well. There's, for our sisters out there, maternal health is a big issue, particularly for the Black community. The fact that black women are up to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy, childbirth, or thereafter, cannot be right in 2024. But also neonatal outcomes. The APGAR score is a score that tests the health of a baby minutes after its birth. So it's a score that a midwife would use on a newborn. Part of that score looks at the color of the skin. So you would not expect black babies or brown babies to turn blue in color, for example. And yet the APGAR score, as I said, it came out in 1952, was rolled out. That wasn't right in 1952 with the diverse communities that we had then. Certainly not right today in 2024 with the even more diversity that we have in our populations. But worryingly, that's an intervention that's been migrated out to other parts of the world, including Africa. So you can understand the issues that we have. You can understand the fact that actually we need to look at the causes of the causes, and we need to de-bias the biases that we have that are built in within the system.
Some of us might think that's a bit of a imperialistic worldview, that we do the experimentations here and then we farm it out to countries, especially countries and continents that weren't involved in the experimentation. So I think that's a great time to bring in Patrick. Yeah. Cultural historian. Again, you'll be able to talk about some of the historic issues that contribute to black people, especially black men's distrust of our experience of the NHS and our distrust within the NHS today.
Yeah, sure. So just adding to what Habib talks about the causes of the causes, yeah. Currently, health and social care policy does not acknowledge the history and the impact of enslavement. So if you look at the typical data sets and the research and the mindset around policy, it starts with post-war Britain. So you didn't actually acknowledge the actual experience of the original generation, ironically, even if it was to look at post-war Britain. But when you come to that wider context around the history of enslavement, it does not acknowledge the links, issues around diabetes, cancer, all those kind of things, even sickle cell. So part of this mistrust is often the way that we're disrespected as a community, historically, and even now around whole debates around reparations, it's almost dismissed out of hand. And that dismissal out of hand is the same experience that black men have when they see their GP, when they go to A&E, when they're looking for help. And often the problem is when we get the help, it's always at crisis mode. It's never at the early stages compared to other communities who might have that intervention much earlier. And the question is, why is it that we are presenting late for everything? You name it, we present late for everything. Mental health, prostate cancer, diabetes, you name it. And part of that problem, I think there's a part of it is about the way that the system is geared up in not acknowledging and respecting that perception of big, black and dangerous. Even though that label is used around mental health, that applies to all black men accessing any kind of health care. That's the first thing. And secondly, I think there's something about us in the community, black don't crack. When we're invincible, we're Superman. I've seen guys walk across the middle of the road as if they're going to, and I don't know how they get away with it, they walk through the middle of they walk across the road, without even looking when the traffic's coming, as if they're invincible. So there is something about this we're trying to create this myth of invincibility where we're cracking, we're dying at a faster rate, we're having higher degrees of morbidity, but yet we think we're, almost like invincible, and like Black Panther, and we can survive stuff.
I just want to stay just momentarily on the causes of the causes. I'm so glad we're here because it links back to what I was saying about the linkages to the past. We have had a whole report, the Sewell report, telling us that there are no issues in terms of institutional racism, and that is we need to move on and stop looking at the past. How helpful or unhelpful is that in this context
Well, I think the report universally has been discredited. So I don't know why we spend so much time talking about the report. I'm sure it's in the raise from the corporate history of civil service as we speak.
But it's still government policy. That there is no institutional racism in this country.
No. Look at the statute book. The Race Relations Amendment Act. It's very clear in law that it recognises institutionalised racism. The report that you're talking about was commissioned by the previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in the context of Black Lives Matter, where a lot of people, especially with the fall of the Colston statue in Bristol, that led to that big debate in Britain, around culture wars, a debate about justice for black people, all that kind of stuff. So the report was designed to not acknowledge that historical racism. And the report itself actually, and that they had to amend the report, by the way. They had to amend it because in one section of the report, it actually said that slavery was a good thing for black people. Very similar to one of the conservative leadership candidates saying that slavery was a good thing, empire was a good thing, so we should be grateful, we should be happy and be grateful.
And that's why we link back to that report, and that's why it's such an important report, because that's the playbook for what we're hearing now.
I wouldn't say the report didn't do the thing that it wanted to do, because that's what we're starting these conversations now. So the report, in many ways, ironically, I remember when the report came out, I was on Breakfast TV. I deliberately wore, I'm a Trekkie, and I deliberately wore a Captain Spock top. And I said, I'm wearing this because that report is in another universe and time spectrum. And I remember I got someone DM me on Twitter saying, Patrick, this is a serious issue. Why are you wearing a Star Trek top? I said, because the report, you can't take the report seriously.
I mean, I appreciate that point, but the reality is that we've not heard from this Home Secretary that there have been that report or that policy. We have a Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, as an example, who will not accept institutional racism because the Home Office instructed him not to when he took the job. So it is very much still a living reality. The people who wrote the report, they're in the House of Lords now, and every now and then they will them out to undermine our struggle to try and advance in this system. So that's the wider context. What's happening in the NHS in terms of acknowledging and understanding historic racism and its impacts? Because I would have thought that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and when we started to learn this whole new language about comorbidities and co-mortality, I mean, this entire new language, it helped us to better understand how historic inequalities plays out today. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on the end of the final point, I think it's also important to understand that even official statistics and national statistics around morbidity and life expectancy, for example, can be analysed and cut in a way that can tell a specific story or a specific narrative. And we know that has been the case, and that was the case with that particular report. So within the NHS and within the NHS Race and Health Observatory in particular, we are pushing for organisations and leaders to acknowledge racism. When you think about, and we hear this quite often now, where organisations say we're an anti-racist organisation. What does that mean? Well, for us, the fundamental, very first principle for being anti-racist is to name racism. If you want to change anything, you have to acknowledge that there's an issue to change. So naming racism is critical. And in fact, we're soon to be publishing our 7 principles of anti-racism. The number 1 principle is demonstrable leadership on naming racism. And that's what we want to do within the healthcare system, is to support leaders to understand what racism is, the structural racism that we see in society, the interpersonal racism around trauma, the everyday racism that we see, and of course how those two come together with regards to the institutional racism that plays out in policies and processes within our organizations, of course, including the NHS.
I'm intrigued by what you said there, because in acknowledging that, you started off by saying what constitutes success. You named one. Can you unpack some of the more or some more attributes? What do we see as success? How do we know that we've got there? You're right. This seems to be very word-based in acknowledging that there is an issue and saying we want to be anti-racist, but give me some more characteristics of success.
The principles of anti-racism include demonstrable leadership on naming racism. It includes focusing on what the data tell us. That's quantitative data, but it's also qualitative data around the lived experience of people. And it's important that we do not get caught up in culture wars, that we focus on the evidence base. We did that, in fact, immediately after the sewer report. And sorry, Patrick, I'm mentioning it again. But we did that because we wanted to highlight, with colleagues such as Professor James Nasru, who's an expert on race and health at the University of Manchester, we wanted to outline the truth around the data, around people's lived experience and how that plays out. And in fact, what we did was to produce a rapid evidence review, a systematic review, and that systematic review did make the front pages of the newspapers. It made the front pages of the newspapers not because it was another systematic review on health inequalities. We've had plenty of those in the past, but for the first time, as I mentioned before, we were beginning to talk about racism and use the word racism in healthcare. So it's important that we have the leadership, we have the data, we have accountability around people's and organizational behavior around this agenda. And it's important that we are able to showcase good practice where it exists, to celebrate the success where it exists, and to put resource, not just money, but people's time into this agenda, because it's absolutely critical we get it right, not just for Black men, but what we do know is that if you get this agenda right in an inclusive way, it will benefit everyone.
Can I just jump in there? And excuse me for being overly cynical and maybe just a little bit critical, but having spent 25 years in government, in the communications wing of government, we learned one way in, first of all, grabbing a headline, one way in actually what we used to call kicking something into the long grass, is to have a review. Now, you talked about the review, but that is just another way of just passing it down the road. And what you've said so far, again, excuse me for being critical, but seems to be a cyclical trait within the NHS to just keep kicking things down the road. And we are going to be here in 25 years' time. I'll be considered to be older. You'll, obviously be a little bit younger because I'm older than you. But what we're going to be doing is revisiting this conversation. We're going to be talking about a review.
And can I kind of push back on that in the sense that it depends what the review is about. Our reports are about the causes of the causes. So if I give you one example, one of the very first pieces of work that we did when we were established was to look at racial bias in pulse oximetry. Pulse oximetry, little devices you put on the end of your fingers to test the level of oxygen in your body, in the bloodstream. That was during the pandemic, which was obviously affecting the level of oxygen in people's bodies. We knew from evidence dating back to 1990, so 30 years of evidence essentially, that actually the darker the color of your skin, the less accurate these devices are likely to be, because the infrared light is less likely to penetrate when you have more melanin in your skin. Now, We did do a rapid systematic review for that. And we did a rapid systematic review over a 6-week period. So when we say rapid, we mean rapid because of the urgency of the situation during a pandemic. Now, if you go back to the we call them 3 legs of our operating model, bring together the evidence base, which we did. We had very clear recommendations for change in that report, that rapid review. There were 4 recommendations for named organizations. And then thirdly, we supported those organizations to make changes. So on the back of our report, we had a number of things happen. The research body, the NIHR, which is a national research body, put out a further call for evidence, particularly from the UK. So they put out a substantial amount of money for focused work from the UK, because the majority of the work, as I said, was from the US. Secondly, the NHS immediately updated their guidance on home pulse oximeters on the NHS Choices website, which is a public-facing website. So that was done almost immediately. Thirdly, the devices regulator, the MHRA, sorry about the acronyms, but that's the that's the body that regulates devices and kind of pushes them through the system. They put in place equality assessment of devices from the outset. And at the time, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Sajid Javid, announced an independent review into equity in medical devices more generally. So on the back of our review, yes, there was another review, but it was a rapid review, but it led to significant change by focusing on some of the causes of those inequalities.
Excellent. That's a great story to hear. Do you want to comment on that, Patrick?
Well, I mean, I think just to add to what Habib said about, obviously you need the evidence to make the case because, as you know, Stafford, when you're a campaign activist, it can't just be based on emotion. You need evidence and data to make the case for change. And that's part of the challenge, that if you don't get the right data, you can't convince people. Because the way that this society works, it's based on data to influence decision makers, whether they're civil servants, research bodies, politicians. And sometimes it's frustrating for community, because community, be lit and know it, the one reaction like from yesterday, even before yesterday. But unfortunately, the way that things are constructed in the NHS and in wider society, I mean, that's what I say. Sometimes there has been change without the evidence, where politicians have made decisions without the evidence because they know it's the right thing to do, or there's so much media prep. Going back to your point about comms, there might have been a successful campaign or which has forced them to do something without the evidence. But unfortunately, when it comes to our lived experience, it's always the evidence. And sometimes, how much more evidence do we need to do stuff? I think there are areas where there are gaps to evidence, and I think the work of the Race Observatory is playing a key role in that. But at the same time, we've got enough evidence to make significant changes in policy and the way that leaders operate around anti-racism. And sometimes, you're quite right, sometimes people use evidence or do a review just to buy time or do nothing at all. And time and time again, that's happened quite a lot. We need to change. We need to reverse that bit more. If we're going to do a review, it has to lead to some clear, tangible difference. If not, let's make it happen.
Because I remember when Paul Botan was a junior health minister. I mean, this is going back to early 1990s. And he said that he believed that the NHS sometimes hid behind the lack of this notion of a lack of data. And that was an excuse for not addressing issues that we in communities know to be real significant issues. And when they don't, and when communities believe that they don't, that our issues are not a priority, then that leads to a greater level of mistrust. And if that mistrust exists, then it's difficult for the NHS then to get the qualitative data because we're not coming forward talking about our lived experience to the NHS. And it seems almost like a vicious cycle.
It does. And in fact, what we know about the NHS is that what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. But that's based upon the principle that quantitative data is a gold standard. But we know that qualitative data is as important, if not more important, than the numbers, because behind every number is a person. And so when organizations or people say, actually, there isn't enough data or there isn't good data quality, there are ways around that. And in fact, engaging with communities, talking with people in communities is probably the most richest source of data and insight that you can get. And it goes back to the point around trust. And I define trust as truth told consistently over time. And when there's a breakdown in any kind of part of that algorithm, there's a breakdown in trust. And we see that with a range of different events or reports. We mentioned, and dare I say it again, the sewer report, the Windrush scandal, Brexit, the race riots of 2024. There are issues that we need to focus on, and we need to make sure that there isn't a breakdown in levels of trust and confidence. We need to make sure that the government and bodies have that level of truth told consistently over time, because trust is fast becoming a determinant of health itself. It's determining people's choices as to whether or not they take up healthcare services. And amongst our black men, for example, that will be a real issue where there's a breakdown in trust because they haven't heard the truth told consistently over time. They will not be able to access, they will not want to access healthcare services, let alone take part in clinical trials and medical research.
Absolutely.
So it's an important point for our healthcare system, our leaders within the healthcare system, within the NHS, for the government to build and rebuild levels of trust with our communities.
I love that you touch on and you explain quite fully about trust is truth told consistently. But we're still being fed lies that women are, or black women in particular, are superhuman in strength. So in childbirth, there is an adverse effect on the mother and baby. We're also told that black men are possessing superhuman strength and finding themselves sectioned more than a white person would. These are disproportionate in terms of outcomes, but this is underpinned by lies. How are we getting beyond those lies? Truth and trust is what we spoke about.
Absolutely. And those are some of the areas that we're focusing on within the NHS Race and Health Observatory. For example, the fact that in schools, in colleges, in universities, undergrad courses for medicine, for nursing, for allied healthcare professional courses, they're not told, they're not taught any of this. Skin color, different conditions on skin color, the rashes, the checking of a baby for its health, the biases inherent within medical devices, for example. So we are looking to diversify education, looking at what gets taught, what features within medical nursing textbooks in terms of pictures, what doesn't feature in those textbooks. So going back to, again, the causes of some of these inequalities. When we put out the report around pulse oximeters during COVID, we had quite a lot of doctors and healthcare professionals that contacted us to say, actually, we weren't taught any of this. Not just in undergrad or postgrad, but also in their continued professional development, the courses that healthcare professionals have to do on an ongoing basis once they're qualified. So it's important that we focus on some of those deep-seated, deep-grained biases and look at how we can remedy those biases at their heart.
If my son, I know when he watches this, he's going to be listening to you, he's going to say, this is long. What are we doing now? This sounds, from what you've said, to be a marathon. I know it's not a sprint, but what are we doing now? Because we are still seeing this inequality now. Babies are dying now. Black men are being sectioned now. What are we doing now?
And also we saw these inequalities really rear their heads and play out during COVID-19. So has anything improved and changed since then, apart from yourselves being in situ, of course?
That's a very good point, actually, Stafford, in the sense that during COVID, we heard leaders, the government, the healthcare system, make very clear pledges and commitments to tackling health inequalities, and in particular, ethnic and racial inequalities in health, because of the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 was having and still is having in terms of long COVID and the after effects on our Black and minority ethnic communities and staff as well. I feel we're at a crossroad right now. We've got a new government, a new administration, and it will be our role within the NHS Race and Health Observatory to support the government in making sure that those pledges, those commitments are taken forward. And for there to be a real focus on, as I said before, not just looking at surface level solutions to these long-standing issues, but to focus on those deep-seated causes of these inequalities. There are a number of things that we can do right now, going back to your initial question. The medical devices review is fantastic in that it's highlighting and is now getting organizations to actually really focus on how these devices are designed in the first place. We're diversifying research right now, not just what these national research bodies focus on in terms of topics. We need more research on prostate cancer. We need more research on digital and sickle cell disease, for example. We need more focused interventions in the here and now for cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure. We know all that. We need these research bodies to focus on those topics as well as the other topics that it does focus on. But we also need more diversity in our workforce, in the researchers that actually lead the research, because there's a very white workforce out there, particularly at senior levels. The researchers that actually lead the research do not look like you or I, for example. And of course, when it comes to workforce, we know that the NHS is diverse. It always has been diverse, right from the outset, right from the inception of the NHS with the Windrush as an example of that. But that diversity is at the lower levels, the lower bandings and pay grades. And we need to make sure we have progression and we have diversity at all levels, including leadership levels of the NHS. If we're in the business of tackling inequalities in health, which we are, then we know that we need a workforce that is representative at all levels of those communities that we're here to serve. And when that doesn't happen, as we saw during the early stages of COVID-19, the pandemic, we know that there is a lack of diversity in thought and decision-making that then leads to the mistrust that we then get within our communities. And COVID was a typical example. I remember, in fact, it was when the vaccine was being rolled out, the initial weeks, the days and weeks of the rollout, that there was a communication that went out that actually there are now going to be vaccination hubs in the communities. We're going to have indoor bowling clubs, horse racing venues. We're going to have conference centers as these vaccination hubs. And I tweeted, I remember this, it was a Saturday morning, I tweeted to say, actually, we also have black churches, mosques, temples, synagogues that are ideally placed to be vaccination hubs. They're in the community. They're well structured, many of them high ceilings, open spaces, and they would be ideal for vaccine uptake for a pandemic such as COVID-19. And the NHS gradually began to engage with the community, places of worship, with community groups. And in fact, I had my first vaccine in the Malcolm X Centre in St Paul's, Bristol, where the leader of the Malcolm X Centre was stood at the gate, inviting people in. So a trusted person in a trusted place, and people were coming in to have their vaccine. So it's about that trust. It's about the truth told consistently over time, and it's a common theme, in fact.
I mean, Patrick, COVID-19, thanks for that answer, Habib. COVID-19, the release of the launch of the PHE, that's Public Health England review into COVID-19, why we were more likely to catch COVID, why we were more likely to die from it. It was released, I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do, the scandal that was around it, because for all of the things you just said, Habib, how important it is to develop trust with communities. The PhD review, the launch of it, kind of backfired and let that down drastically, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think before the review, there was a lot of, as you know, a lot of black and minority people dying on the front line. Frontline staff in NHS, frontline staff in transport, frontline staff in retail. And the government's initial approach was basically saying, well, we're the carriers of COVID, it's all our fault. That was the initial, and then that herd immunity strategy was, and so I picked, or someone used the expression, let the bodies pile high. So we were collateral damage, yeah? And as the more we found that people of colour were being affected by, a whole range of professionals, and that's why I think the work of the Observatory was important. But a whole range of people were from different professional bodies and disciplines were saying this is not right, and that forced the government to commission that report. But even with that report, parts of that report was missed out. The work that Kevin Fenton did was, I can remember journalists. I was contacted by journalists trying to find Kevin Fenton. Because he did the report. The report his bit wasn't included, so eventually it came out. So even that caused a controversy. But the real part of it, I can remember at the time, remember when the government installed this new West Wing at number 10. They had the proper, where they had the daily press conferences, and Matt Hancock was challenged quite a few times, who's Secretary of State at the time, about COVID and the black and minority experience. And he kept saying, COVID does not discriminate. When he got COVID, and Boris Johnson got COVID, at that same press conference, Michael Gove said, the Prime Minister's got COVID, the Secretary's got COVID does not discriminate. But we knew it did discriminate because it reinforced the structural racism and all the isms of society, in many ways. And that's why I think there was a community response. There was faith leaders, community groups working in partnership with NHS and local government. There were loads of webinars and events to have a dialogue. And as what Habib talked about, this trust and confidence. For a moment, people said, okay, let's work together. Obviously, there were lots of conspiracy theories going around. We know that. There were loads of conspiracy theories were going around the community. But at the same time, a number of us said, right, let's engage with this. I mean, one of the things that I did, I worked very closely with Yubele, and one of the things that, because so many people died during the pandemic from the Black and Asian community, there was no emotional support around grief, bereavement. When our family members died, if they went into hospital, that was the last time you saw them. You would never, and then when, in terms of burial rights and all the restrictions around burial rights, everyone was affected, So, I lost a family member, friends, everyone. We were in a period of anxiety, and fear, a real fear. Where could it be you? Could be a family. It could. I mean, and there was no proper acknowledgement by the government at all what was happening to people, black and brown people, none whatsoever. So therefore, that reinforced, they don't care, they don't trust us, we don't trust you, and that's still there. That is still there.
I'm absolutely still there, grafted from me.
And just on the back of that, that's absolutely right, Patrick. And in fact, what we were told at that time in terms of the disproportionate impact on Black and Asian people was that, and there's some of the reasons we were given: more likely to work on the front line, more likely to have comorbidities, more likely to live in multi-generational.
Comorbidities, please.
Oh, comorbidities, more likely to have other diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, etc. And more likely to live in multi-generational households. But what we weren't told is, why was that happening in the first place? Why is it that Black and Asian people are less likely to find themselves in the boardroom, more likely to find themselves working on the front line and having that ethnicity pay gap?
Women on the second home or third home.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Go and hang out.
Why is it that they're more less likely to live in open space, green space areas? So again, it goes back to the causes of the inequalities, and not just the cause of the inequality.
Absolutely.
One thing we've not really kind of like delved into is about trust and engendering trust and gaining trust. Just going back to you, Patrick, in terms of what constitute trust and what will actually foster trust, would there be anything that jumps up, springs to mind that you want to kind of get to the forefront?
Well, trust is based on history and context, let's face it. And on what is a history, particularly of the Black experience and governments and statutory agencies, is based on history. So, which is very similar to the history of what happened with African Americans in America. Remember, at one stage, we were part of clinical trials for the wrong reason. Therefore, you have it already, and it's part of that historical context. And I think anti-racism is good and important, but underscoring that, and a bit that's not been properly acknowledged, is anti-Blackness. And that is one of the legacies of enslavement. And what I mean by anti-Blackness, or Afrophobia, and you can spell it with an I or O, it means that from the period of enslavement 400 plus years ago, where we were treated and seen as subhuman, that still exists. So that's reality. Classic example, even just 2 years ago, that teenager in Hackney, strip search in school. And then we found out that other Black teenagers and Black boys and girls were also strip searched in school. And it was mainly Black kids. Why was that? Because they wouldn't do other communities because there's still lack of, our humanity is not respected at all. And that's part of the problem that we have, access to healthcare, and particularly for a lot of Black men, they, in terms of our identity and humanity, you don't need to read the paper sometimes. You could just look at someone and straight away. You can pick up the vibe straight away. We're spiritual people. We can pick up the vibe from 10 miles away.
It's constantly denied, right? We can pick up the vibes, and when we do pick up the vibe, it's constantly denied, right? So Habib spoke about the numbers of Black people in the NHS. We talk about the Guinness effect, and we've been talking about the Guinness effect for decades now. So Black at the bottom, and then as you get higher up, it becomes white. And we see the outside in communities, we see the treatment and the experience of some Black staff within the NHS. So, for example, if I go to my doctors, on the reception desk, there's a sign that says, if I raise my voice at those staff there, they're likely not to give me a service and ask me to be removed. But Black staff in hospital are still telling me that when white people say, I don't want that person touching me, that person is still given a service. The Black staff is often moved away from that person because that person happens to be racist. I mean, it's right, the Black staff should be removed. They shouldn't have to put up with racists. But the racist is still offered services. So there's a lot of challenges. There's lots of ways that Black people see other people's experiences within the healthcare service, and it still has that kind of impact. So what are we doing about developing and improving the lot for Black staff in the NHS?
Well, my previous role, when I was working in NHS England, we developed something called the Workforce Race Equality Standard, in short, RES. And that's about closing down the gap between Black and minority ethnic staff and white staff in terms of the opportunities that they have. So making sure that we actually get progression of ethnic minority staff across all the way to the senior levels and at board level as well. And in fact, just before COVID, we set, when I was in NHS England, set targets for every hospital trust to meet the that aspirational goal at all levels. But also not just around progression and opportunities, but also around closing down the gap in terms of experience. And bullying and harassment, victimization, discrimination that Black minority ethnic staff face in the NHS is still significantly higher than that experienced by their white counterparts. And that gap has remained pretty static, if not grown slightly, I think, during the COVID years. As well. So there's a lot more work to be done. And diversity is important. But I always say that diversity is not always a precursor to inclusion. And in fact, we've probably had one of the most diverse governments recently, but the policies haven't been anywhere near as inclusive as they should have been. So there is work to be done. And of course, we know that changing the culture of an organization doesn't always happen overnight. I used to say, think Mo Farah rather than Usain Bolt, but I think both have now retired. So that's probably not a good analogy. But in some cases, it will take slightly longer to shift culture, whereas increasing diversity, you can have an extra Black or Asian person on your board, and that will change your figures overnight. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we have the culture that is inclusive and fully engages all staff as part of that intervention.
Can I, address the elephant in the room? We've spoken quite a bit about trust. We've spoken about truth. We've talked about naming things as we see them and calling things out. Now, listening to the dialogue of equals that we've had, I feel something on my chest which is telling me that this needs to be spoken about, and that is, if we are to move forward and to move forward with any speed, we need to start calling things as they are. In terms of systems and practices, would you not say that the NHS is institutionally racist? And perhaps calling it as we see it would speed things up in terms of remedies?
Absolutely agree with you. In fact, there's probably not a single organization out there that isn't racist or has a level of racial bias built into the policies and the processes. But it goes back to the point of what can we do in the here and the now to shift the dial, and acknowledging that racism exists. Leaders actually saying, yes, my organization is racist, and this is what we're going to do about it, is really critical and is really important. And it's not just about words, it's about actions. It's what will people actually do. And in the context of healthcare, and in fact, in terms of any other area, it's about evidence-based action, looking at what works, learning from what hasn't worked in the past is critical.
Patrick, you want to come in on that?
I think the question that you raise is an important one, an interesting one. What more can be done? But I think I just feel there's a kind of a hierarchy of how black and minority staff are treated, not just in the NHS, but also in local government, civil service. And it's always seemed to be that actually there are not many black males working at senior level. The sisters are doing okay, but they got their big challenges, around discrimination, constantly having to perform. But I think for black men, we're not even in there in the first place. So it's interesting because this podcast is about black men, talk about health and well-being, but it's also about opportunities around work and making money and raising families and doing stuff like that. I just feel just my observation, looking around and the organisations I'm involved with, sometimes I'm the only black male in the room, which is quite an indictment in 2024.
Well, we don't want to end on a negative note. So that's an indictment in 2024. Can we see improvements in the NHS within our lifetime? Can we see rapid improvement? And can we see an NHS that's earned and deserves the trust of our communities? Can we end this podcast by sending out hopefully some positive messages to the black men, the black community in general, but the black men specifically who will be listening to this podcast?
Absolutely, Stafford. And I'm pretty optimistic. We've got, obviously, the NHS Race and Health Observatory that's focusing on the causes of the causes and calling it out as an excuse remover, as a body that's holding up a mirror to the rest of the healthcare system. And we've got a new government, a new administration, and I'm positive, optimistic that we will be able to turn the dial on some of these deep-seated issues. But it cannot just be down to the government, to organisations, everyone working in the NHS, our communities. People in our communities, we all have a role to play. We all have a role to play to close down the gap between the promise of our ideals and the reality of our time. And unfortunately, that reality does include the stark inequalities that we see for our communities and our healthcare staff as well. But we need to be optimistic. We need to make sure that our compass is pointing in the right direction, our moral compass is pointing in the right direction, and we need to speak the truth.
Thank you, Abid. Patrick?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a total optimist anyway, and what I see, apart from obviously in terms of the structural issues around leadership policy, it's about what we do for self. So I'm very lucky. I've seen a new generation of black and minority health professionals, and I think our job is to try and create the opportunities, the leadership, the mentorship, the coaching and possibilities. I've sat on I've sat on quite a few health awards as a judge. I've sat on about 5 this year, and there is talent there, but they need to be nurtured and supported. They will be the future leaders, the future decision makers. We don't want them to be in a situation whereby either after a while they leave the NHS, or they give up, or they just accept other faceless approach. Oh, this is my lot, and I'm not going to progress my career. So we've got to create the environment for talent to flourish and to support the talent as well. And that means that for people who may not think about working in healthcare, and the beautiful thing about working in NHS, I don't know how many professions or disciplines, probably 1,000 if you were to break it down. There's opportunities for everyone to work and contribute to. It's still a great institution despite the fact that satisfaction levels have gone down, and it's even more so with the black community. But it's an institution that we pay into as taxpayers. We have fought for it, and we have to be in there to make that change.
Excellent. Man, I think that's a brilliant way to end our first program.
Amazing way to end it.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
Okay. Habib Navqi, Patrick Vernon, thank you for your time today and your contribution.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take a step, go, get checked. Want the best for you, no less. Stubborn head, make sense. NHS before it goes left. Me and my unks had a dialogue of equals. We're tired of all our people dying before they seem to. Silence don't make you peaceful. So many open wounds don't even know how we'll heal all. But this is food for thought of a meal. It might be a free course. You know the usual 9 nights and funerals. High and by at the graveside like time is recuperable. Ignore the treatable symptoms. These will cause a domino effect. You won't make it home to the loony board. Take a step, go, get checked. Want the best for you, no less. Stubborn head, make sense. NHS before it goes left.
Any information provided on our podcast series is for educational purposes only and does not substitute for professional medical advice. We advise listeners to consult a medical professional or healthcare provider if they seek medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We value different opinions and experiences in our program, and any information shared by our guests should be seen as their personal opinion. We have guests who are medical practitioners, but we do not have a medical doctor on our production team. We've added extra information from reputable sources on our website if you want to inform yourself further. We strongly advocate for everyone taking responsibility to inform ourselves about our health. We cannot be liable for risk or issues associated with using information discussed during this